The pirate planet continues the Doctor and Romana's quest for the key to time in the first ever serial penned by Douglas Adams. Arriving on the planet of Zanuck, our leads find some trouble making it to Calufrax, where the next segment is located, and end up having to deal with a half-robot captain, his robot parrot, and all of the other bizarre ongoings of this world. This is one of those stories that is just really quite a lot of fun to watch. The style of this serial is genuinely rather interesting and weird because it is a blend of a number of things. The actual setting on the surface of this planet is quite large, with a good deal of scenes shot on location, and it's such a bright and colorful place that our duo arrives at, but they also spend time in small claustrophobic houses and caves, which naturally do give a bit of a different flavor to this serial. Not to mention, you have these characters who are all dressed in yellow with incredibly pale faces, and move rather slowly but are nonetheless quite powerful, and also there's the captain who is very loud and shouty, and on par with the level of over-the-topness we got last time with the Grafin Decay. I'm going over all of these things because they are primarily what adds up to this story's overall style and feel, which on the whole is a little bit scattershot. It has all of these things that come together to create a story that I'm not really sure what to compare to. It does stylistically feel unique, and maybe it doesn't completely land, but at the end of the day, what we're left with is a story that works. It's just a fun, bizarre, and thoroughly entertaining serial that I had a really good time with. This is definitely a rather comedic story, which is nice to have. Comedy in Doctor Who is always something I find appealing, at least when it lands, and that was the case here. This was helped significantly by our main characters, the Doctor, Romana, and K9. These three together honestly just work so well because our Time Lords do have this incredibly unique dynamic, which I would argue Doctor Who hasn't ever seen before. The first Doctor definitely didn't get along with Barbara and Ian at first, but that wasn't really played for comedy as much. It was just a part of their relationship. Whereas here we have someone to challenge the Doctor in some respects, because Romana knows what she's doing for the most part. There are some things she hasn't figured out yet, and she's not used to traveling in this way, but she is jumping right into it and proving to be unequal to the Doctor. It's a combative dynamic, primarily pushed by the Doctor's insecurities. He's used to being in charge and telling his companions what to do, and throughout these first couple of stories, we get to see what happens when he travels with someone who in many ways knows just as much or more than him. It's not just that it's a rather interesting thing to watch portrayed on screen, but it's also, as said, a ton of fun. The relationship between the Doctor and companion contributes to the comedy of the Pirate Planet and the style that we see here. And honestly, looking at all the things this story does, which I've already gone over a little bit, it really couldn't have been anything but a comedic serial. If this one had not leaned into that, at least a little bit, because I don't want to terribly overemphasize that aspect of the story, but if they hadn't done that and filled moments that maybe wouldn't have been as interesting with some lighthearted comedic banter between our main characters, the story would have gotten even more of a focus, which I doubt would have worked as well to its advantage, considering all the different elements at play here. And I could be wrong, maybe you could strip out all of the comedy and have changed up a lot of scenes and the way they play out, but then you just have a different episode, wouldn't you? And K9 is a character I really enjoyed when I was a kid. I've always had fun with him and found him amusing, but one of the things I came to realize throughout season 15 is that he just wasn't quite clicking with me the same way he had when I was a child, which was a bit of a shame if I'm being perfectly honest. I did still enjoy him and found that he added a fair amount, but I definitely liked him more the very first time I saw him over a decade ago. But other than me having aged a decent amount, one of the other factors here might be the stories I watched, because in The Pirate Planet, K9 is quite good and adds just the right amount to it. He's genuinely useful in moving the plot forward while also adding just a great little sprinkling of comedy throughout, and he balances so well against our two leads. So maybe I just like K9 Mark II more than the first incarnation. We'll see more as we continue through this season. The supporting cast this time around does their job relatively effectively. There are certainly some characters who just prove to be unmemorable, some that work rather effectively, and others who are just ridiculously over the top, but I don't think there were any that really took me away from here, and sure, the captain is incredibly over the top, but as with last time, I didn't really mind all that much. Would I have preferred a more menacing villain? Maybe, but I don't know if that's necessary. And also, I think this bombastic performance of the character is made less grating by the simple fact that this one is, in many ways, a very silly story. I can't talk about too much of the things in here, nor would I want to if you haven't seen it, but there are just a number of ways in which this serial is ridiculous. They make so many choices in here that definitely aren't the most serious way you could portray a situation, but are the way they chose to do it. I mean, just look at the villain and his parrot sidekick. It's incredibly silly, and they do manage some moments of legitimate drama with this character, don't get me wrong, but for a great deal of the runtime, he does a lot of loud shouting and isn't a super intimidating character, which I was fine with, because honestly, this story is genuinely very silly. It's absolutely worth discussing the actual story because I thought Douglas Adams did a good job in that respect. It's not great, but it's good. All of these elements come together to make something quite unique. Right from the very beginning, we see that things aren't going entirely right for the Doctor and Romana as they land on this planet, and nobody seems to know why they haven't made it to Calufrax. And my interest just carried throughout this entire thing as we kept being introduced to these new elements and our characters kept moving from location to location. It doesn't feel too overly familiar to what we've seen before in the show. It feels a little bit fresh. At 4 parts long, I did find this to be a pretty well-paced adventure, and this blend of interesting story and comedy with our main characters all meshes together quite well to create something that just works. Again, stylistically, I think my brain just doesn't quite get this one. It feels like all of these things coming together in the way that they do just shouldn't work, but it does, and The Pirate Planet is a genuinely solid story. I do want to get more into the actual details of what happens in here, but that will require some spoilers, so you can skip to the time as shown on screen if you do not want any of this one spoiled for you, and if you're going to stick with me, then let's get started. One of the things I think this one does a rather good job at is its revealing of information. There's a couple of twists towards the end of this thing that change your understanding of the events that have taken place to a certain degree, and most everything makes sense by the end of the serial. I personally thought they were all well handled. The main ones I'm referring to being 1, the planet they landed on, Zanuck, was using Calufrax for energy and resources, 2, that Calufrax was a segment to the Key to Time, and 3, that the captain's nurse was actually the Queen. This information all comes at different points in the story, and it's just handled really nicely. You start off not knowing what's going on, and then you get some hints as to what may be happening with the Key to Time tracer going off everywhere, and the story just keeps moving and moving and continues to just keep you invested. They did a really good job with that. They could have saved everything to the end and then thrown it all at you, but instead they went for really pacing out this information to keep you invested, which was absolutely the right call because this one never fails in its goal of being entertaining. I can't really speak to the actual shock value of these twists because I saw this story back in, I think, 2011, and I had a pretty good memory of what the segment of the Key to Time was, this being my 3rd time viewing The Pirate Planet. So in all likelihood, these events are going to surprise some people and come as quite expected reveals to others, but also I don't think the shock value of twists and stuff is ultimately that important. It's really about how the story fits together and how natural it feels, and to me, it feels well integrated and natural enough. I mean, the shock value of surprise, it's really not that important when it comes to the actual meat of a story. I will say, what I can talk about though is how well they are developed within the narrative, which I think is really well handled. It's just like pretty neat storytelling. Having said that, there is one thing I want to move on to, and that is the captain's nurse, aka the Queen. Just 2 serials ago, we had the Sontarans turn out to be the secret surprise villains that were behind the story, and that was something I felt didn't work, and added very little to the narrative while also worsening it to a degree. Here, the surprise villain thing works a little bit differently though, and I think it works better for a couple of key reasons. For one, in the Invasion of Time, there are no memorable villains whatsoever. I don't remember any of their names, and they didn't make any kind of a lasting impression, but here, the villains are actually memorable, for better or worse. I already went over the robot pirate, but I think the standout villain from here is the Queen. I think the actor performed her character rather well and brought something to the role. It's not the easiest to pull off a surprise villain who gets limited screen time, but I think they really managed to make it work effectively. And also, when you go back through the story, you can understand why she is doing what she's doing. She's controlling things from a passenger seat next to the captain, and I think that tracks throughout. And not just that one reveal, but the rest of the revelations as well. When you rewatch the story, it all does kind of make sense, and it never feels like it was pulled out of absolutely nowhere. The story was well planned out, and that absolutely comes across in the final product. Also, remember the robot parrot? I absolutely love that we get some moments of him and K9 facing off in this. It's absolutely ridiculous and quite silly, but very much fitting with what this one is doing, and more importantly, just a ton of fun to watch. I mean, if you have two robot sidekicks from the protagonist and the antagonist of the story, and you don't make them face off, I think it's fair to say that you've failed in your job as a writer. So well done to Douglas Adams on what is an equally ludicrous and delightful scene. And this is the last thing I needed to get into, but I have a plea for all of you watching this review. Please help me to understand why the Fourth Doctor starts to reach in as if to shake Romana's hand after they've accomplished their mission, before immediately pulling his hand out and ultimately not shaking her hand.
Congratulations.
Clever, eh?
It's such a bizarre little moment. I've tried looking into it and have completely failed in finding an answer, and am at this point convinced I never will. I don't know if this is some kind of a clever joke my smooth brain can't understand, or if it was a simple mistake or practical joke. I just don't know, you know? But if you have any idea what that scene even was, feel free to let me know. I'm baffled by it. I do not understand. Overall, I had a good time with The Pirate Planet and consider it to be a highlight from what I have encountered with the Graham Williams era so far. This one somehow successfully blends a really bizarre mix of elements which, in some way, managed to create what is an undeniably entertaining and fun story featuring a brilliant TARDIS trio who help in adding to the fun that this story has. I had a thoroughly entertaining time with this serial, and I am going to give The Pirate Planet a rating of 8 out of 10. And that does it for today, everybody. If you have any thoughts on the story, then feel free to leave them down below. I do hope to see you around on some upcoming Sunday in the future for a review of the Stones of Blood. And if not, that is absolutely fine, so long as you know that I appreciate your time here today. And with all of that having been said, thank you very much for watching. Take care, and have a lovely week.